Chapter 231, Obelisk. In an area far away from human habitation, where winter reigned and the light of the sun hadn't blessed the land in weeks, a disturbance was taking place. Eternal darkness blanketed the area for a week and would continue to do so for weeks more, but that wasn't what caused such a change. A storm nearly a mile wide was responsible for such a shift. The already formidable winter winds carried snow and ice alike as it spiraled around a dome at the storm's center. If one were to look deeper, past the physical representation of the elements, one would gaze upon the reason for such a disturbance. The mana in the area funneled into the dome at a rate that sent the surroundings into a frenzy. The flow was so detached from its normal paths that it clashed with the magic outside of the storm's influence. The beasts in the area had felt the shift at first and noticed the subtle draw that siphoned some of the mana away but thought nothing of it. They'd felt a beast evolve before and knew what the process entailed. The area would return to normal in a day or two and all would be fine. Except the draw didn't end. Days turned into a week, then into two. The draw only seemed to increase, and more mana rushed in to replace the amount siphoned. The localized storm grew more intense as more and more of the mana currents were disrupted and the concentration grew. Some beasts, the smaller and less proud, took it as a sign. They left the area for fear of what was to come and knew they wouldn't stand a chance. Some stayed and basked in the dense magic, taking the opportunity given to them, using it to grow as fast as they could. None noticed the dome at the storm center. None even considered that it was the cause of all the disruption. That wasn't their concern. The only thing they had on their minds was to make use of this opportunity while it lasted. Tracy. Point of view. Ma'am. The Southwest Dungeon is sending out a stream of dungeon monsters into the surroundings. Shipments from Greenfield have been halted as the city prepares for a siege. A runner came rushing in, adding to her laundry list of problems since Nick left. Without those supplies, all construction will come to a standstill. Monica, her head foreman, exclaimed. I know, Monica, but there's nothing I can do about it. Tracy sighed. She fought the urge to rub her temples in frustration for what felt like the millionth time. Bruises had already formed from her doing it so much already, and she was attempting to break the habit. Nick had truly gone and screwed her. She told him what would happen. Even knowing it would, it still stressed her out when her predictions came to fruition. Who would have thought taking all of our fighting force on a campaign would leave us in dire straits? Who could have predicted we would be in this situation when he came back and took half her construction crew? When Nick arrived back to the city with a smug grin and an ego the size of Texas, she had wanted to slap the man silly. Besides trying to remain underestimated, there was another reason she hadn't entertained the thought. Nick felt different. Tracy wasn't sure what it was or how he did it, but there was a wellspring of power around the man since he returned, and she wasn't sure if she would win in a head-on confrontation. All the training and skills she picked up to make up for her offensive weakness didn't feel like it would be enough in the face of whatever Nick did. She'd asked him, revealing what she could sense vaguely, to not tip her hand, but Nick refused to answer, stating she would know when it was time. The bastard. The fact he hadn't gallivanted off to conquer another city was the only good thing that came upon his return. She wouldn't have known what to do if he came back demanding more fighters. Instead, he came demanding workers, the scant few that she had left. The city he managed to conquer was in dire need of repair and fortifications that he took all of her best in the trades. Then, to make it even worse, he took the fighters with him as well, stating that without walls or fortifications, he needed them to defend his new capital. Hearing that he planned to move his capital wasn't that big of a surprise. She'd known that ever since reports of the perpetual storm around the northwestern city, he would pack up and move. Tracy wasn't sure whether to be relieved or hurt that he decided not to bring her with him. She was proud of what she built here and was reluctant to leave and start over, but to not be asked hurt her pride. She had turned her home into a veritable fortress, even larger and more robust than the one she led in the tutorial. The continual rise she managed to bring about had plateaued, and she struggled to keep it from all falling apart. All the problems were adding up, and she couldn't find the time to both grow the city and defend against the threats. The most problematic of which was this new dungeon break. With Nick taking everyone that could fight, There was no one left to delve the dungeons. Tracy knew that without them the dungeon would break, but she couldn't afford to send people out there to keep it from happening. The dungeons nearer to the city were already hard enough to keep delved. She'd rather a break happen farther away than right next door. For months she tried to juggle all the problems, and this was only the first one to drop. There would be more. She was sure of that much. And it couldn't have come at a worse time. People who traveled from city to city were rare. Not many braved the wild, and even fewer volunteered to drive supplies to and fro. Merchants trying to level were some of the only few other than people looking for adventure. Some did it for fights as well, as the forests and plains held beasts strong enough for a challenge. Especially with the rising mana levels. As they plodded from city to city, word carried with them. It was slow, glacially slow most of the time, but it was her only source of information outside her sphere of influence. Before her runner came barging in with yet another problem to manage, she was trying to make sense of the one that had already come up. If word from the travelers was to be believed, an obelisk was found. If it was only that, she would have dismissed it. People came into the city every day spewing odd shit, but too many details added up this time for her to do that. The area it was found was peculiar. If looked at on the map, it was in the center of what lay east of the mountains. No map she had detailed anything west of the mountains, and it was sparse at best on what it did show. At best, she knew of the east coast to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf to the northern reaches of Canada, but only vaguely. The only places with more detail were the direct surroundings of where her city stood. Markings depicted the pylons they knew of and the various pieces of civilization that managed to put themselves back together. Nick's new city to the north, a pylon in the middle of Iowa, one in Minnesota, and a few marring the coast. Travel to the south was nearly impossible, as getting past the river hindered all movement. The ones along the coast were guesses mainly, as it was hearsay in the first place that they even existed. Another was in the same boat. One was marked for ice and stood far to the north, surrounded by question marks. Tracy wasn't sure where the city stood, but she was at least sure about one thing. She knew it hadn't fallen. Anything beyond that was outside her capabilities. Staring at the map alerted her to why this obelisk sighting was odd. Without confirmation of if the obelisk was even there, and with only that to go off of, it wouldn't have been that large of an issue. While slightly alarming, it wasn't as important as keeping the dungeons contained. What sealed the deal and made the problem the highest of her priorities was that there was a countdown ticking away on one of its sides. Supposedly, when the timer was counted out on a calendar, it marked the exact day everyone returned from the tutorials. When it hit 0, it marked 2 years exactly. She didn't need a fortune teller for what it was for. Their test was due. We have to send word to our neighbors. Maybe send someone to verify what was said. The closest is Des Moines. They could be convinced. Plans were forming on what she was going to do. Hendricks. Point of view. 1.5 years, and they were no further than when they started. The haunted woods remained unconquered. It felt like the eerie fog was laughing in their face for even trying. A part of him wanted to smash whoever came up with the name, but once it was said, it had stuck, and it was too late to muzzle the man responsible. It was fitting, but that didn't change the fact he didn't like it. He knew too many that had died in the woods for the name to feel like anything other than an insult. The decision was made, and they pulled back to the coast. Any inroads they made into the forest were lost, and the forward operating bases were mothballed. Hendricks and his team were relegated to protection duty after the invasion failed. It spurred him to give up on the efforts to reach Washington, but they couldn't keep throwing bodies at the problem. The Navy, or what they could rebuild, secured what shipping lanes they could find. The coastal cities doing their best to make up for what their area didn't have. Hendricks and the rest of the army secured the West. Any E-ranked beast was marked, and it was his job to hunt it. The admiral had ordered them to focus efforts on other avenues, and that was his new job. Even if he didn't like it, there were other places in need of saving. I doubt any of them are still alive anyway. It's not like they were fit and spry, let alone any semblance of athletic. He wasn't the only one with that opinion of the politicians they were trying to save. It wasn't like they were the picture of health. Some claimed they were all dead already, and their attempts to rescue them were unfounded. Hendrix put the odds at less than half made it through the tutorial and most were likely dead by now. Not that he would ever say that aloud. Now wasn't the time for division. Captain, the Admiral wants to see you. The man was off before Hendrix could respond. Let's see where we'll be going this time. Hendrix and his team were one of the few to survive the haunted woods. Not only did they survive, but rose in power faster than the rest. To commend that achievement, his team and a few other teams like his were moved up the chain of command and given tasks others weren't or couldn't handle. The last break they had from normal operations was a few months ago. Last time we sailed around the haunted woods up the coast to liberate Philly. Maybe we get to go south this time. Sometime on the beach would be nice. It took a while to navigate through the command center, but he reached where he was needed in a few minutes. He had to wait a little longer to be seen, but Hendrix was used to that by now. The Admiral was surrounded by people and runners. More information flowed through one room than their entire settlement. More than all of their combined settlements. And the man at its center was a force to be reckoned with. The 4 stars on his shoulder were impressive, but it was the presence he gave off that Hendrix was more wary of. It was like staring up at a mountain impossible to climb. Hendrix prided himself on being one of the strongest in camp, yet even he wilted in the face of him. "Sir." Hendrix saluted and dropped it after it was returned. His back was ramrod straight and only slightly misted with sweat. "New intel has come in that we need confirmation on," the Admiral said firmly, giving him no chance to refuse. "Where are we headed?" Hendrix asked. "With the maps out of date, our best guess is St. Louis." Papers were shuffled as one was picked out of the stack. "Everything we know is in here." Hendrix took the offered paper and tried to keep his face neutral. It was a single paragraph on a sheet of paper. Not much to go off of. A strange obelisk was said to be found counting down to the date the tutorial ended. "It marks 2 years exactly from when we returned, and we think that our prophesized test is here. Your orders are to locate the obelisk, confirm if what was said is true, and send word back." "Yes, sir." Chapter 232, Lively. Austin. Point of view. "Ah, home sweet home," Austin voiced in relief when Frostbound came into view. He was getting sick of the carts and the structured traveling. He liked going at whatever pace he wanted and being able to venture off when he found something interesting. He still did that, but traveling with a group felt like a tether pulling him along. Austin didn't like being tethered. He hadn't before, but now it felt even worse. Doing his best not to think about the negatives along the journey, he instead thought of the positives. He would finally be out of this horrendous cold. They knew leaving when they had would put them arriving just past the solstice, but they had decided to go anyway. A decision some of them were regretting. Mitchell looked more like a fat bear standing on 2 legs than a man by this point, with all the furs draped around him. Others took his lead and covered themselves in layers of the stuff. "It can hardly be called home when you haven't been here for nearly a year," his mother chimed. Austin knew the comment would come up at some point. His mother had been blessedly non-confrontational about his time away, but now it was time. "I know, Mom. I told you I didn't expect to be gone for so long." Austin droned. He really hadn't. He expected to get to where his profession was dragging him, fight the thing around the treasure, and then be off with his prize. A few months tops. Not the escapade it had turned into. "It looks so much different," he couldn't help but say. His mother looked toward the snow-covered city at his comment and left his previous answer alone. Thankfully. "I know. It's hard to imagine sometimes that all of this was done in under a year," she said. Austin still remembered last winter when they were still trying to find a place to call home. The scene of wilderness and snow, it used to be overlaid over the thick walls of stone, and his mind struggled to find similarities. Even the walls were over-engineered. He knew they would be, but it was absurd how thick they were. "Who needs walls that tall?" Austin muttered. "It's not like anyone's gonna march out to the ass end of nowhere to attack, especially in a place that gets so cold." His mother only laughed quietly. Chris spent so much time designing, building, and dreaming of his great fortress, he sometimes forgot to realize that no one was going to come up here to attack. If they did, They were either insane or monumentally stupid. Every time Austin would mention it or say it wasn't that serious, Chris would channel his father from the grave with a serious face. Expect the best. Prepare for the worst. Austin thought the entire thing was insane overkill, but hey, they did almost get attacked by demons, so maybe he was wrong. But he still stipulated that no human army would be getting through what he was looking at now. The walls shouted their endurance and resistance to anyone who would listen, and now that he had an anchor of his own, he could truly appreciate what was done to them. They felt like a piece of Chris inhabited each and every block that made up their construction. They embodied his anchor and felt like nothing he could do would mar their chiseled faces. That alone would have been enough to deter Austin from attacking with a force, but he knew that was only the start. While he wasn't there to see it, he had been there when Chris and Gabriel were brainstorming ward designs and functions. Austin just knew that now that mana crystals were coming in, some of their more insane ideas were given the green light. They had originally scrapped them because there was no way to power them, but that wasn't an issue anymore. "I don't remember there being so many people," Austin remarked. When he left, the city, more like a small town, was barely a few hundred people. What met his eye now was over 5 times as many, and that was only what he could see. Most would be huddled away indoors this time of year, cuddled up next to a roaring fire. If this many were out and about in this weather, how many people lived here now? "Well, you kicked things off by recruiting everyone you passed," his mom said. "It was hardly everyone I passed. I had to kill some of them, the spineless thugs." Then Chris went a step farther. He sent out people far and wide to bring people in. People come in droves from all over. From Toronto and what used to be Quebec to far to the west of here, she said. "Personally, I could do without the French speakers, but they're nice enough. Sometimes." "How many people live here now?" Austin couldn't help but ask. "Oh, easily a few thousand. When we left it rose just past the 5,000 mark. Now that we've been gone for a few months, I don't know, 10 maybe," she said. Austin was happy they had the foresight to build with the future in mind. The outer walls were huge compared to the few hundred people that could have possibly manned them before, but now that wasn't big of an issue. If they'd built smaller, they would be running out of space with all the new people coming in. "How come we didn't see anyone coming this way if new people are arriving all the time?" he asked. His mother just looked at him like he asked a stupid question. It took a second, but then he remembered the feet of snow on the ground and the piercing cold he was currently heating his body against with his law. "Yeah, I heard it. Stupid question." The walls loomed large from a distance, but they were truly a marvel up close. It was to a degree Austin was sad to have missed their construction. Not enough to hold off leaving again, but enough that the thought popped into his head. "God damn it. Get back here, you little shit." A voice called from further in the woods to their left. Their group was using the path through the trees that had naturally been carved from so many people coming and going that he hadn't realized someone was nearby. What followed the voice was a high-pitched, playful bark and more grumbling. It wasn't until Hal came streaking out of the trees chasing a small dog that he got a picture to put with the yelling. "What is he doing?" he asked. "I'm not sure," his mother said curiously. It was at that point Hal noticed the band of travelers and a smile bloomed. "Austin, it's been too long." The target of his chase was forgotten as he jogged over to the group and gave everyone a big hug. Said target didn't like being ignored and followed after, an ironic turn of roles. It has. How have you been, Hal?" "Can't complain. Yourself?" "Same here." Austin gestured toward the 4-legged creature currently chewing on a stick. "What do we have here?" "Oh, him. He's just the most wonderful piece of shit to ever exist." His voice was high and inviting as he rubbed its head, making the dog completely oblivious to the insult his words held. "Sarah took in some wolves while you were away, and they had a litter not too long ago. I thought it would be fun to take one in and maybe get a companion out of it," Hal said. "I didn't realize how much of a pain in the ass it would be." Austin observed the man and wolf, and it was nice to see them together. Hal handled what happened well, but it was always nice to see people getting through their issues. Losing Kyle had hurt him more than he let on. "It's no falcon or eagle, but it's close," he said. Austin bent down to lavish the thing, but it jumped away from his touch. Saddened, but understandable, he backed off. What's its name? Ryder. The name sounded so normal, like a name that wouldn't be out of the ordinary for a German shepherd. The litter ended up being bigger than expected, and a few other people stepped up to take one in. Sarah only kept one, and that one's a bigger handful than this one is. Hal said, "You two can catch up later. It's cold as balls out here, and I have a nice warm fire waiting for me inside." Mitchell yelled in faux anger before stomping off through the snow. Everyone else followed behind and funneled through the gates. Standing on either side were two guards who watched them pass through. And they weren't the kind of guards like they had manning the gates before. Those had been mostly volunteers who did it because the job needed doing. These were different. Their gear was similar enough that spoke of an organization behind them. The people fighting for Marcus were similar to how Austin remembered the guards here to be. A mishmash of all kinds of weapons and armor from people scraping together what they could. Everyone used their own individual gear or what they could get their hands on, which made each person equipped differently from the next. The new gatekeepers stood with a purpose and were decked out in gear nearly as good as his own. Well-crafted furs over heavy-duty leather along with weapons of a make only few could achieve. Austin didn't need to get a closer look to know there was a flame motif stamped somewhere on the weapon. He also didn't need to scan it to know that runes would be lining them as well. Austin motioned at the two stoic statues with his head. "They seem so official." "They are." "What do you mean?" Chris started an official fighting force. He did it in the form of guard companies, but they're essentially a standing army. When did he do that? Right after the fight with the demons. He realized the need for a funded force directly under the command of the city. "We mostly do guard and police work right now, but we train together simulating large-scale battles for when the time comes." Austin stopped and turned toward the man. "We?" Hal sighed. "Yes, he convinced me to take charge of the scouts in a more formal manner. He pays us well and gives us priority when it comes to gear. If it's made of metal, everything gets made by him or Vinny. Runes too, the whole 9 yards. "Oh shit. You're for real." Austin laughed. "How many people do you command? Should I be calling you captain or something?" Hal's face told him he wasn't far off from the truth. "More than I thought." The orders kind of exploded in popularity when the benefits were announced. Not many can afford good gear and jumped at the chance to get it for free. Others liked that we got designated slots in the dungeons. With the extra people, a wait list began as there were too many people and the dungeons couldn't keep up with demand. Hal said, "Elliot and I stumbled at first as neither of us were prepared to organize and lead so many people, but we have a handle on it now. Things fell into place after a while. Group unity was something I didn't know how to foster in the beginning. Turned out that giving ourselves a name and calling ourselves orders instead of up-jumped guards did most of the work." "Orders? Like knight orders from fantasy books? What did you name yourselves?" "No, wait. Let me guess." Austin said, "The unbending steel rods of Dash." "No, I'm not letting you guess because everything you say will be an insult." Hal quickly cut him off. "I named it the Order of the Wolf. While that encompasses everyone, it's broken up further into subgroups. There are 2 currently, but I plan for more. The trackers are sectioned under the Gray Wolves and the Scouts are the Arctic Wolves." Austin stifled a laugh and fought to keep what he said not sarcastic. "I like it. It's creative." He looked at the little wolf following after them and laughed. "And original." "Oh, fuck off. I never claimed to be creative." "You said there were 2? What about the other one?" Hal laughed. Elliot couldn't decide on a name, and everyone under him proclaimed themselves the Order of the Lollipop. He got so frustrated he just followed my lead and named it the Order of the Bear. "The Wolves and the Bears." Austin repeated slowly, "I sense a theme." Yeah. Chris said the same thing, and I'll tell you what I told him. If he didn't like the name, he shouldn't have given us free rein to come up with one. Hal snipped. "Enough about that. Let me show you around." What followed was a much longer tour than Austin imagined. The place was just so big and everything had changed from what he remembered. People were still living in lodges off in the distance before, but now there were streets lined with houses and shops. Warehouses and inns stood along the road leading in from the gate, and there was even a dedicated crafting district. It felt like an actual city instead of a crowded campsite. Even Marcus's city felt more like an army encampment than a population center. All of it was covered in a thick blanket of white, but that added to the charm rather than took away from it. Even with his distaste for the cold and snow, there was a rustic charm to the design. Horse-pulled sleds brought people from place to place, sliding over packed snow with ease. Some had sleds designed for cargo instead of passengers. Plots of land were still open in some areas, as construction was working through the city in sectors, but it felt lively. This was the first place that Austin hadn't felt the perpetual worry that usually permeated the air. People walked the streets without being armed to the teeth. Some even walked around unarmed. The towering walls surrounding the city did more than just look imposing. They gave people a sense of security Austin hadn't seen anywhere else along his travels. It was so different than everywhere else. Not that he had seen the whole world, but he'd been to a few different places and nowhere was like this. Last, but not least, is the city center. The inner wall is still being built, but everything else is fair game. There's even a building for you. Hal pointed at the massive stone blocks being lifted in the air by wooden cranes and multiple lines of thick rope. Their tour weaved through the streets between the construction of the inner wall and the outer, but now they passed over the line and reached the area around the castle itself. He knew only family had places in here. "A place for me?" he asked. "Yeah, come on. I'll show you," Hal said. The buildings in the city center were much more sparse as there were only a few standing. Most of the space was still left open and ready for future expansion. The few that stood were obvious in their use. Vincent's Forge, a leatherworking building for Sam and Ashley, even an alchemist lab for his brother Connor. A few others were hard to identify, but he knew they were for someone else's craft or use. What stood out was one building surrounded by glass and seemed to be made of it. There was so much of the stuff it looked like an enlarged fishbowl rather than a building. It was formed in a various array of curves and angles that his mind couldn't even guess at the reason. It wasn't until Hal stopped in front of it that he realized this was the building for him. He didn't want to be ungrateful, but it was hard to be excited with what he was looking at. "What is it? Go inside." Chris spent a long time building it. Hal didn't answer but urged him toward the door. With no reason to decline, Austin inched toward the door slowly and pulled it open. The inside was much like the outside. As much of it was made of curved glass, but there were obvious signs of formations as well. He wasn't sure what they did, but the glowing lines looped in and around the various glassy curves before all converging at the center of the room where a small seat stood. As the only thing in the room besides the walls of glass, he walked toward the center. As he did, the clouds parted slightly and the light of the sun escaped confinement, and Austin found out what the glass did. All the many curves and angles that looked painstakingly built all worked together to reflect the light into one point. The light mana it carried followed suit and converged at where the seat was placed. Austin didn't know what to say. It was perfect. Chapter 233, Dancing Lights. Chris, point of view. It was over. Blissfully over. I wasn't sure how long it had been, or how many days had passed, but it was done. The mana rushing in, around, and throughout my body had finally settled into something normal. The new normal of everything was wildly different from what used to be the case, but my mana was finished arcing out erratic spurts or massive waves causing pain. The meld between my mana channels and circulatory system was still unfinished, as that was a lengthy process and one that would take weeks to complete, but the main part of the technique was over. A new power accompanied the beat of my heart, and it sent mana cascading through my entire body. Zoning in on my heart with my mana senses made it feel like there was an 8-cylinder engine roaring constantly and peaking with the beat of my heart. It was wonderful. The pain that was linked to having frigidly cold Arctic mana shooting through delicate areas was gone, and now all that was left was the feeling of power. My body used the mana coursing through it along with the oxygen my blood usually carried to become more than it once had. The two combined, working together in more ways than one. Both sides of the coin were represented. The physical and the magical both were used as fuel instead of only one. I wouldn't know the extent of the changes until I got back and tested it, but the initial discoveries were promising. It was even more of a change than getting a body of wood, as there was more to build off of. After the ignition was over, I took a few days of rest inside my dome and caught up on some much-needed sleep. My 3-month estimate for how long it would take was wildly off and allowed me some time to rest. Either the mana here was purer and more abundant, or I could have stopped and done this much further south. From what I could tell when I finally broke out of the dome was that around a month had passed. The darkest days were behind us and light was slowly coming back a few minutes at a time. The solstice had passed and winter had begun. I could almost feel it in the air. After giving my body enough time to rest from the built-up exhaustion, I did a deep dive into the changes. I still couldn't go full out with my infant mana heart, not until my mana channels were merged, but I could still play around and feel the difference. The first thing I tried to do was grade how well I did. The only options were full or perfect, but I wanted to check if I succeeded in achieving a perfect ignition. The differences weren't apparently large, but they were enough to be 2 different grades. The problem was I had no way to tell. The new power my body held was obvious, and it certainly felt like a perfect ignition from the large jump from how I used to feel, but it was also possible the jump was from a full ignition. I thought that was unlikely, but it wasn't like I'd ever seen or felt one before. The books had ways of discerning the various grades, but I had none of the stuff necessary to do so with me. Rachel would be able to tell, as her senses were way better than mine when it came to mana, but she wasn't with me. After resting and breaking out of the dome, I didn't immediately head home either. I had allotted for 3 months and then a few weeks for travel back, which left me free to do pretty much anything. Using all of the extra time wasn't a requirement, but I certainly took the chance to relax when it was offered. It had been so long since I'd truly relaxed. The area I set up in was completely different than how I remembered it, and there were carcasses of various beasts picked clean littered around, so I quickly packed up and left. Something must have happened in the area while I was working on the technique. Luckily, the formations did their job, and I didn't find any signs of damage on the dome. I wasn't sure what would have happened if I'd been interrupted during the time I was forcing down mana, but I imagined it wouldn't have been pretty. Besides the bones in the area, the place was surprisingly calm. Whatever happened had run its course and was settled by the time I was finished, which was good. I wasn't yet comfortable getting into a fight. My heading was south toward Frostheim, but I wasn't in any hurry to get there. My trip north was mostly on a tight schedule, but now I wandered and took in the sights. I spent one night laying in the snow watching the northern lights dance across the sky. The greens and teals swirling around purples and blues with a backdrop of twinkling white stars. The sight was something that went beyond art. I doubted a photo or painting could capture everything my eyes were seeing. It was rare for the lights to be seen where I lived before, but they were a common occurrence now. If the clouds were scarce, they were visible nearly every night. I'd seen them before. Frostheim was far enough north to be within range, but this was the first time I was so close and gave myself time to sit and simply gaze at them. Lying in the snow, looking up without any pressing thoughts. A day quickly stretched into a few more, but I didn't care. It was nearly a week before I pulled myself away. As much as I liked it up here, and the silence and ambience it held, I had to get back. Before I did that, though, there were a few things I had to do. My trip back was going to be filled with backbreaking work of working through mana channels, but it was nice to have a destination in mind. Traveling home felt much better than leaving. Austin. Point of view. Where is he? Austin couldn't help but ask again. You know, we don't have to go through this song and dance every week, Hal said dryly. Austin wanted to snark back with something but decided against it. He was frustrated, and Hal didn't deserve it getting taken out on him. It's been months and winter is nearly over. Exasperated, Austin lamented in boredom. Even Abigail and the rest of them are on their way back already. Hal looked up from the papers on his desk. Chris very well could be on his way back too. Austin only grunted at that. There was no way to contact the man to find out if he was on his way back or not. Abigail could, with her profession, but she wasn't here to do that. Even if she was here, she only used it in emergencies. Gabriel was attempting to create a better way for communication through enchanting but hadn't had much luck. The best he could do was copy what the fort already had with paired rocks which weren't available until after Chris left. Chris hadn't even tried to do anything with it yet. None of the runes he knew could be used for communicating as he focused on what he could use for wards and equipment. I know, but I'm bored. Austin flopped onto the couch on the side of the room. This couch is uncomfortable. It's not supposed to be comfortable, Hal said while not paying attention to his complaining anymore. Do you want to fight again? Austin asked hopefully. They'd sparred a few times over the winter and they were one of the few fun things to do. I'm busy, Austin. Is there something you need? Yes, entertain me. There's nothing to do and everyone else is either gone or busy, he said. Austin wondered when everyone became such workaholics. While most were gone and were down with Marcus where he just came from, those that stayed in Frostheim rarely had free time. Vincent rarely left his forge and was pounding away constantly. Gabriel was the same in his workshop. Braden was still fully focused on building things and Sam was buried in work. With so many new people needing winter clothes, the leatherworker was up to her eyeballs in orders. Connor, the bookworm, was off with Mitchell trying to make new and improved poisons or some other concoction. Where did your mother run off to? Austin asked. Rachel had left not long after Austin arrived. She was nominally in charge while both Abigail and Chris were away, but now that he was back, she took off while she had the chance. It was slightly insulting that she thought he would run off again, leaving her stuck to run the city. Not that Austin did much of that anyway. Hal took care of most things, which was why he was in his office doing paperwork to begin with. Frostheim ran smoothly now that the craziness had died down. Abigail ensured that with her strict organization, but with new people arriving every day, there was still a need to be more active occasionally. You know where she went, and I struggle to believe you've already forgotten, Hal dismissively said without looking up. He was right, Austin hadn't forgotten. It was annoying his aunt got to go exploring while he didn't. It was his profession, not that he needed the experience. He would reach the cap well before he was ready to evolve at the rate he was going. But Austin, you know I love you, but please get the hell out of my office. I can't concentrate with your yapping. Hal finally broke. Austin had wondered how long it would take. Longer than I thought. Go strengthen your bloodline or work on your laws or do anything else that's not in my office. Part of the reason he was so bored was because what Hal listed off was so dull. The process itself was extremely repetitive, but he couldn't even do that anymore to pass the time. Not because he was finished, but because for a different reason. And not because he was slacking off. The building Chris constructed for him worked perfectly together. Today wasn't one of those days. One of the frequent snowstorms common this time of year rolled in, blocking the sun, which left him without anything to do. He couldn't even blow off steam in the dungeons, as both were already booked out for the day. Austin sighed before dragging himself off the uncomfortable couch and made for the door. Did you ever get Sam to give you that final checkup? She was looking for you the other day. Hal suddenly remembered. Sam? Doesn't ring a bell. I don't remember a Sam that I know. Maybe she was looking for someone else. Austin rushed out of the room much faster than his previous sedate pace to escape questioning. The healer was pushy after he went through body refining. She poked and prodded all over his body to make sure everything worked the way it should have. The level of scrutiny was unnerving. With both Abigail and Ashley gone working on water stuff, it left Sam and his grandmother as the de facto healers. Well, Sam. Grandma was still in F rank and couldn't really do anything to heal him at this point. Especially after refining his body. He didn't have the insane fortitude Chris had that made things hard. But a body of wood was difficult enough even healers at his rank would struggle if they didn't know their stuff. Some still threw mana at the problem like that was all that was needed. After he made his swift exit, he was left to wander the castle aimlessly. He had to admit it was pretty cool living in one, but that novelty had worn off by now. There is one thing I can still do. Austin shook his head before he could entertain the thought. Doing it down south was fine and Marcus didn't seem to care, but he couldn't do it here. It wouldn't be good to mix work with fun. He also didn't want to make it awkward when he came back occasionally. Flings were fine when he was in places he wasn't planning on returning to or didn't care that much about. They were less fine when he'd run into them after the fact. Frostheim was big, but it wasn't big enough to eliminate that possibility. The added possibility that his mother would find out and then grill him to know everything about the girl only made his decision to not do it firmer. Nope, not in a million years. Just picturing it made him shudder. Maybe Connor made what I asked already? Chapter 234 presents Abigail. Point of view. It was wonderful to be home again. The trip was slightly longer than first anticipated, but it was well worth the extra time. The sheer number of people who advanced was not to be understated. Nearly everyone with the water affinity was able to form mana cores. Only a few didn't, but various reasons were behind their choice. Sadly, some failed to forge one, but others made a conscious choice not to, instead focusing on improving their law with their time around the treasure. Chris allowed everyone to read through what he called a technique more like suicide with extra steps, and they were holding out for a better option that fit them. The mages, though, had no excuse and all went ahead with the technique to forge a core. Abigail herself had done so and now had a glowing core where her mana pool used to be that radiated power. As the technique labeled it, she'd finally decided on what she was going to do. While she was still a healer and would continue to have those skills and abilities, she would never be the best healer. She had already mixed the two. Her evolution to F rank was a battlefield healer variant that provided buffs as well as healing skills. Her E rank evolution took that a step further and gave offensive spells as well as the occasional healing adjacent ones. Being a healer was now only a small portion of her skill set. People like Sam, who only stuck to healing classes and skills, were much better than her in terms of healing ability. The only reason she had been able to keep up with them was sheer stubbornness and her law. Hours spent training simply weren't enough to bridge the gap. Not everyone in the family gained their laws the same. While their affinity was how they saw water differed. Just how Gabriel's and Christopher's ice laws were vastly different even though they were the same element. The restorative property of water that Abigail first gained her law with gave her an edge when it came to healing and skills like Waters of Renewal. Without that edge, her ability to heal would have dropped off ages ago. She would still be able to do it, but not as well as a pure healer like Sam. Which was why she chose the mage route when she forged her core. The change would be difficult, but it wouldn't be impossible. All her previous classes gave the stats she needed, so it wasn't like she would be behind in that respect. It was the variety of offensive skills that hindered her. Rachel and Gabriel had nearly a dozen skills to call on for every situation that came up. Abigail only had a few. She could buff herself with her support skills and heal herself, but she only had a few skills dedicated to attacking foes. Numerous plans were in place to fix that. The first was to purchase skill shards with the type of skill she wanted. Things like Water Bolt or Water Whip were common enough to drop from dungeons as new as theirs. They had already noticed skill shards dropping, but Abigail suspected the rate was disproportionately low. Not that it was a bad thing, just that the people who received the drops would sooner use it and gain the skill, or if it wasn't suited to them, knew someone who could before they started putting them up for sale. Which left only the occasional skill that no one wanted to be sold to the city. Time was the only solution to that, but the other was the continued upgrades of their pylon. Further reach would increase their odds of seeing skills up on the market. The second plan to fix her deficit was to make her own skills. Gabriel lectured enough about his view on skills that she knew it was possible. He ranted and raved about the underlying skill matrix, as he started calling it. Abigail didn't know the first step to even begin doing that, but it was an option she could look into. The much easier way would be to use pure manipulation. Forming a whip of water from pure manipulation ability was infinitely harder than just using the skill for it, but it was much more flexible. Her daily practice to do just that was producing results, but just not at the rate she liked. Improvement was improvement, she wasn't mad about that, but it was slow. She could use it in a fight, but it would be clumsy and not very powerful. Burning her bloodline was the only way to get it to the levels she needed, but that also put her on a timer as there was only so long she could do so. Her new core helped surprisingly. It was like her connection to the water mana was stronger and the effort it took to manipulate it went down. It was a hidden benefit she didn't remember reading about. "Mommy, are we there yet?" Anna called, drawing her thoughts to a halt. "Almost there, sweetie. Give it a few minutes and you'll see it. She answered. Both Anna and Josh loved exploring the new city and had spent nearly every available moment running around to what they could see. John was nearly run ragged by their enthusiasm. They had calmed down after the first few days, but they were still a handful to watch over. Abigail had felt bad, but John kept telling her to focus on herself and he would be fine, which did nothing for the slight guilt she felt leaving him to deal with the two whirlwinds alone. Thankfully, the trip back to Frostheim was blessedly uneventful. Hal wrote a number of reports about the increasing threat as the beasts continued to grow, which had been a small worry as they traveled home. She had noticed large caravans forming of people wanting to leave Marcus City, and they only did so when a suitable number was reached. As the citizens reached safe havens and the overwhelming desire for survival wore off, so too did the urge to get stronger, forcing some to only travel when numbers were on their side. Most still tried to grow. Both dungeons under their control had wait lists growing longer by the day for teams to delve into, and others ventured out to kill real creatures in the wilds. Others took the profession route to get stronger. They didn't have the combat ability, but they had the stats to deal with most things. Vincent had one of the highest strength stats behind Chris, and when he swung his hammer, it was not to be taken lightly. While the vast majority of people fell under those two categories, some didn't care for a life of bloodshed or slaving away at a craft, as they called it. They were content to live peacefully, which left them vastly underlevel compared to most everyone else and woefully unprepared if they tried to leave on their own. The beasts roaming the woods would eat them up and spit them out before they could so much as blink. Especially the ones stuck at level 25, as they didn't have the requirements to evolve. Abigail's thoughts turned toward her grandmother as she stopped advancing at that exact level. But there was nothing she could do about that. Her thoughts drifted until the walls came into view not long after she told Anna they would. Their arrival sparked a small crowd to gather, but most continued on their way like nothing happened. The sled pulled them through the city with ease, and it wasn't long before they were home again. Both little ones jumped off the sled and ran into the castle while she was left to help John bring in all of the luggage. "Mom! Mom! Uncle Austin's back!" Anna cried from inside. "Austin's back? I thought he would wait until the last moment before he had to arrive." She knew the group sent to help Marcus was on their way back and had arrived already, but she expected him to venture off somewhere, only returning when Chris did. "Yes, the most valiant and magnanimous of all your relatives has returned to grace you with his presence." His voice dripped with sarcasm and playfulness that only made her children giggle. "I notice how you didn't say strongest." John poked at his inflated ego as they walked in. Austin rolled with it. "Is that a challenge, my good sir?" Her husband only laughed. "I'd rather take my chances against Chris. At least I can hit him back rather than being used as a pincushion." "All right, honey. I'm off to see my family. You got the kids?" John asked after he set everything down. "I got 'em," Abigail said. "Say hello to your mother for me." John's family didn't take up any significant roles running the city, as none had the urge to. They were part of the group, content to live peacefully. Austin sighed dramatically. "He's going to miss my grand reveal of what I brought back." Anna and Josh both perked up at that. "You brought gifts?" "Of course I did. You think I'd forget, you little rascals?" "Gifts, gifts, gifts," both chanted in unison. "For the lovely little lady, I bring this." He brought out a tall and thin box, around 4 feet tall and barely a few inches wide and long. "And for you, little man, I brought this." The second gift was much smaller and about the size of a fist. Abigail instantly knew what it was. So did Josh, who tore into his present with abandon, revealing the rock everyone knew it held. "Thanks, Uncle Austin. I'll add it to my collection." Josh ran off before anything else could be said. "Add it? I wasn't the first," Austin asked. Abigail shook her head. "Chris beat you to it. Bastard." "Hey, that's a bad word," Anna chimed. "Yes, it is," Austin nodded. "Do you want to hear a few more?" "All right, that's enough." Abigail interrupted and redirected. "Why don't you open your gift?" Attention diverted. Anna tore into her gift and revealed a long stick. A stick that had one pointy end and a shaft about as tall as she was. Abigail's brain stopped for a second after she recognized the gift. You got her a spear. That I did. The most noble of weapons and the most popular in human history. He said smugly, completely missing the face she was making at him. I also have it on good authority that spears are the coolest. Seeing how he wasn't understanding her outrage, she repeated, You got her a weapon. Austin looked confused. Yeah, it's about the age she should start learning. Isn't it? She's 10, Abigail cried. The man had the gall to look confused, like he wasn't sure if being 10 was too old or too young. Ignoring the idiot, Anna, honey, why don't you let mommy hold on to that so you don't lose it? But I wanna. No buts, young lady. Fine. She was disappointed at getting her gift taken away, but it was for the best. She was not letting her daughter run around with a deadly weapon. After Anna left, Abigail tore into the man. What were you thinking? He put his hands up in defense. Hey, I honestly thought you guys would have let her train by now. She's been asking for a while. She's a child. Yes, a child that will get a class soon enough. I'm not having this discussion with you, especially when I just walked in the door. Technically, you walked in a gate, not a door, the smartass said. It took everything in her to stab the man with the spear she confiscated. But she pushed the urge down and only glared. And, just because she couldn't get any more on her plate after just arriving, Hal came running in at that exact moment. Chris is back. When they first arrived, she was surprised they had beat him, but it turned out they were only ahead by a few hours. The conversation suitably postponed, they gathered atop the castle to watch him come in. He came from the north, which was on the lower side of the cliff, and gave them a clear view as he trudged closer pulling a sleigh. It was clearly made of ice and it left deep trails in the snow as he marched on. Whatever was on the sleigh was heavy. Austin sighed from where they all watched. I half expected him to be riding a mammoth when he came back. The outlandish idea made her say something back instinctively. How would he even do that? He has no way to tame one. I dunno, Austin shrugged. Beat it up like he did the horse. That only worked because Sarah was there to tame it. You can't just beat something up and hope it becomes obedient. You can't. You dash. A synapse short-circuited as she tried to comprehend his stupidity. I can't with you. It had been less than an hour and he was already on thin ice. A feat he would probably smirk at if she said it aloud. Gabriel thankfully stopped the man from saying anything else. What do you think's on the sled? The group watching as Chris neared grew as more people heard the news, and it wasn't long before most were standing atop the castle watching. Austin flared brightly for a moment before he smirked. It's for you, Gabe. For me? Gabriel asked. What could he have possibly? No, he didn't. That was all it took before he was off running through the city. Not one to enjoy being left out. Abigail glared until the man answered. The only thing she could notice was the sled contained a giant block of ice with something inside of it. Whatever was frozen inside was too obscured to make anything out, but somehow Austin had. The perks of having a bird bloodline and high perception that she didn't. What is it? Abigail asked. Frustratingly, he answered with a question. What does Gabriel want most right now? That's obvious, he wants a bloodline. But our pylon isn't capable. What's the other way to gain a bloodline? He brought a live beast back to the city. He better not bring that inside the walls. Chapter 235, Foxes and Phoenixes. Chris, point of view. Don't you dare bring that in here. Abigail's cry sounded from atop the castle walls as I trudged toward the gate. Shrugging sheepishly, I adjusted course to right under where the castle stood, only a few hundred feet below on the lower side of the cliff. Abigail had plans to involve this side of the cliff in the future, but they remained just that. Plans. We didn't have a way of traversing the vertical gap right now, nor was it a high priority to figure out. Eventually, when we had enough people and it was crowded enough, we would be forced to expand to down here, but that wasn't the case right now. While I pulled the much larger sled than the first I created, Gabriel came scurrying around the cliff as fast as he could without falling. It was nearly a mile to get to a spot that wasn't as steep and could be used to traverse, but it required finesse. Most travel went further down until the transition was more gradual, but Gabriel had enough stats and skills to make use of the rockier terrain without too much issue. It was little surprise he came running down first while everyone else took the long way down. He knew I brought a present just for him. Getting and capturing said present was a bitch, and took forever, but I finally managed to snag one and bring it with me. It made the trip back longer, as having to haul a giant block of ice was easier said than done, along with everything else I brought back with me. Pelts, furs, and hides of all manner of beasts got stacked up and packed away. The massive antlers of the moose were a nightmare to pack around because of their wonky size, but I made do. I'd wanted to throw them into the woods more than a few times, but I stopped myself from doing so. My skinning could use some work and ruin some of the materials, but there was enough for Sam to work with. Ashley spent more of her time on healing, which left Sam as the foremost expert when it came to leatherwork. I had some asks of them that only she could do. My cloak was getting an upgrade. The vine bear pelt I used to wear had fallen to pieces from fighting, and the wolf was too destroyed from shattering hammer to make anything too large, but that wasn't an issue anymore. I brought more than enough to make a full set of clothes from beasts I personally killed. I wasn't sure why that was a sticking point for me, but it was. It felt right to wear something I had a hand in killing rather than something someone else butchered. I had enough for a variety of things, and I was excited at the possibilities. In addition to the pelts, I brought anything that felt magical to my senses. Some beasts funneled mana into various parts of their body, which made them worth more. The claws and fangs of wolves and big cats were the most obvious, but smaller antlers of elk and horns of a bison were also packed away. Also, a few beasts even had mana cores that I snagged. Mana cores didn't usually start becoming common in beasts until D rank, but some managed to form them early. Most likely because of the dense mana up there, but I wasn't an expert. The list of materials packed away grew as I came across things I wanted, and instead of filtering out what was important, I made the sled I was dragging bigger to accommodate everything. It was comical in size now. Bigger than I was tall and longer than a semi-truck of ice slid along the snow behind me, leaving giant tracks in the snow wherever I went. It took nearly my full strength just to pull it. The frictionless property of ice was the only reason I could do so in the first place. I managed to reach a stopping point long before Gabriel finished his descent, and I sat down on my sled to await him. "Chris. It's good to see you, brother." Gabriel's efforts to examine what I brought made the hug rather quick, but I didn't blame him. It was nice to see him this excited about it. "Is this what I think it is?" He stared wide-eyed at the frozen beast. Now, you have to wait until everyone else gets here before opening presents." I mocked. He snorted. "Don't even start with that. You were the one that couldn't hold back during Christmas. That's patently false. I remember on many occasions it was you tearing into the gifts early." I said. "I was a bastion of patience." "Yeah, right?" Gabe sassed. "It must be my memories that were rattled from all the hits to the head." "No, wait. It's you that fights with a giant hammer. What are you two bickering about over there?" Abigail cut in with the rest of the group that came to meet me. "Sister, how was Twin City?" A short hug accompanied my greeting. "Good. Marcus was friendly, and I can see a long partnership ahead of us," she said and hugged me back. "Mom, how are things?" "Perfect now that you're back." "Austin, man, is it good to see you. How've you been?" Good. I see you're whole again. I can't believe I missed making fun of you for losing an arm. So many jokes left unsaid." Austin lamented. I still remembered the ones he made when I lost a finger. I couldn't imagine the number of jokes he would come up with for an arm. The same scene followed with the rest of the group. The group who left with Abigail along with the people who stayed behind minus Rachel. A round of hugs later, I took the time to examine all of them. "You've grown," I said. It wasn't only Abigail either. Everyone felt much stronger than when I last left, the winter months doing them good. Austin had changed the most, but he had also been away the longest. "So have you, as annoying as that is," Austin remarked. "I don't know why I thought I caught up, as you clearly don't follow the same rules." "You get used to it," Jonathan cut in. "I had my anchor for barely a week before he came back with his own. Don't even get me started on his law." I thought I was good having a Tier 1 ice law out of the tutorial and he comes blazing in with a Tier 2 law. Gabriel added, "Hey, this is supposed to be a warm reunion, not pile on Chris for being different." I defended. All three men just looked at me blankly. "Fine. Then I guess you don't need this, Gabriel." I faked pushing the frozen beast away and that got him to change his tune real quick. "Let's not be hasty about things. It was all in good fun." He scrambled. "Yes. Let's talk about the live beast you were planning on dragging into the city." The cadence of Abigail's voice was slow, dragging out the two words. "Because that's what you were planning to do, wasn't it?" I looked down. "I will not confirm nor deny. I had been planning to bring it into the city. In my defense, my ice kept it completely restrained, but it was a better idea to keep it out of the walls. It would wreak havoc if it somehow got out inside the city. It was hard enough to capture the first time without killing it. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do it again." "Well, what is it?" "I can hardly see anything through the block of ice." Everyone was already staring at it in suspense, so I removed most of the ice to let people see it clearly. With the ice blocking their vision removed, they could clearly make out its features. A long snout filled with short, sharp teeth. A fur as white as snow, near-perfect camouflage in its environment. A body not much larger than a human if one was lying down. And 3 fluffy white tails. "It's a fox." Austin unhelpfully degraded my prize. "Not just any fox. A 3-tailed Arctic fox," I said. Austin wasn't convinced. "Which is still a fox." Gabriel, on the other hand, looked at the beast with wide eyes. He had been looking for a suitable bloodline forever. He was upset that most of us had one already while he didn't. My mother also didn't have one, but she wasn't as disappointed by it as Gabriel was. "What's so special about it?" Austin asked after seeing Gabriel's heavy glare. "It's one of the best bloodlines when it comes to pure manipulation. Arctic foxes are natural mages. Their small size and physicality make it hard for them to win fights against larger creatures. But their magical abilities more than make up for it. They're born with an innate ability for spells and magic rather than having increased size and strength." Abigail summarized. "It was also near the top of Gabriel's wish list when it came to bloodlines," I added. I had looked for the other things Gabriel wanted but couldn't find any of them. Even if I did, I doubted I would have been able to capture it and bring it back. I had to run from polar bears, let alone anything with draconic blood. Now, you can still wait it out until we chance upon a Frostbound, but I highly doubt we'll find one of those. While I saw mammoths and woolly rhinos that came back from extinction, we still don't know if there are dragons here," I said. Gabriel, like Rachel, had dragons at the top of his list for bloodlines, but without a method to buy it from the store, he was left without a way to get it. "No, this is perfect. While it's not as flashy as a dragon bloodline, it's just as good," Gabriel said, still not taking his eyes off the beast. "Good," I thought. I was worried he wouldn't like it. It would have made all the work I put into capturing and hauling the beast pointless, but that was nothing compared to the other reason. Gabriel had already evolved without a bloodline once, missing the first chance to empower it. Missing a second chance to hold out for a dragon bloodline would have done more harm than good. It was good that I wouldn't have to convince him otherwise. Not having a bloodline before evolving to E rank wasn't that big of an issue. It was something he could recover from, but missing the first two to boot, would have left him far behind. Austin wasn't convinced. "How are foxes comparable to dragons?" "Dragons aren't the end-all be-all," Abigail answered before Gabriel could. His rants got lengthy. "As much as Rachel would have you believe, they aren't the uncontested best bloodline. It depends on what you want." "Why are you arguing for it, Austin? You didn't even pick a dragon bloodline and you had the chance to," I asked. The man scoffed. "Yeah, but I got one just as good that fits me better. You're comparing a fox to a phoenix. The highest tier of Arctic fox bloodlines are comparable to your phoenix one," Gabriel defended. "At the peak of its power, it turns into the 9-tailed Arctic kitsune, which can rival frost dragons in strength." "A fox can rival a dragon?" "A 9-tailed fox, and yes it can," Gabriel answered. "While dragons may sit at the top when it comes to fire, they can't say the same for all the other affinities." Austin coughed. Fine, allegedly sits at the top when it comes to fire. Gabriel sighed before muttering, but I'd like to see a phoenix beat a dragon. So, you'll take it then? I asked my brother. Of course. It's a top-tier bloodline for my affinity. I'd be a fool not to, he said like I was stupid for even asking. All right then, I said excitedly and clapped my hands. Connor! Get to it. Connor blinked. He looked at me, then at the barely contained beast, then at me again. Yeah, I don't know how to do that. My grand plan began to crumble. What do you mean? Aren't you an alchemist? Yeah. But that doesn't make me all knowledgeable in every aspect of it. Connor cried. It can't be that hard. Just, extract its bloodline. Austin nudged his brother. First of all, the process is much more complicated than that. And second, I don't even focus on that. I make poisons and explosives. Sometimes potions when we need them. I have no idea where to start when it comes to something like this. He waved at the animal. You're an alchemist, though. Shouldn't that account for something? Don't you have a skill that could help? Austin asked. A vein in Connor's head bulged. The only reason I can do what I do now is because I have a base understanding of chemistry from my degree. Poisons, explosives, even potions somehow are similar enough to what I know. The processes are wildly different, but I adapted enough of my old knowledge to suss out new ones. This, he pointed at the fox, is a complete mystery. No amount of chemistry knowledge is going to help to distill an animal's bloodline. Well, shit, I said. Do you know anyone who could do it? I do. But you're not going to like who it is, he said. At my stare, he continued. I know all of the alchemists in the city and none would know where to start with this. No one here focuses on this. The only person I know who delves into this kind of stuff is at the fort. Oh no, I didn't like where this was going. How would you even know that? You've never even been there. Abigail cut in. Connor looked aghast. Did you think I wouldn't investigate further after you told me someone was trying to make vampires? You guys just came back and dropped a bombshell like that and expected me not to ask further questions? That's Bat's hit insane and I'm here for it. I wrote a letter to him to see what his ideas were and he was surprisingly amenable. He added thoughtfully, we don't write often, but he's a good dude. Connor, Austin said slowly. Are you telling me you've been in contact with someone attempting to make a race of demons and that wasn't something you deigned to tell me? Connor wilted slightly at his brother's intensity. I didn't think you'd care. Of course I'd care. Austin yelled. Vampires are awesome. Abigail pinched the bridge of her nose. That's not, you know what, never mind. Chapter 236 Tidings and Rumors. You wouldn't think they were awesome if you had to fight them. Hal threw out. Austin scoffed. What do you mean? I'm the embodiment of their natural weakness. To illustrate his point, his skin began to glow and the snow around his feet began to steam and melt. Gabriel, on one of the rare times he took his eyes off his present, shot down that idea. That's assuming what we know about vampires is true. Just because our folklore says they're weak to the sun doesn't mean they actually are. Austin doubled down. Even if that's true, I still don't see the issue. We've fought all kinds of random things. What's one more? They're an unknown. Abigail cut it. The only thing we know is from fiction or what used to be fiction. What if they have mind powers? What if they can compel people? There's too much we don't know that supporting this idea is ludicrous. She directed the last sentence toward me, but I only shook my head. She knew my stance on that and it wasn't going to change. Just because I refuse to interfere doesn't mean I support it. It doesn't have to be one or the other, I said. When she made to rebut, I added, I'm not getting into this with you again. We both know where the other stands. Thankfully, she didn't push further even though I knew she wanted to. Connor, I said, dragging the conversation back. You say this alchemist would be able to do it? Connor nodded. If anyone can, it would be him. He then hesitated and thought momentarily. You know, he's not that well liked over at the fort. I wonder why, Abigail snorted. Connor's insinuation was clear. Shaking my head, I responded. I may not actively go against what the man's doing, but inviting it into our home is another matter. He's a great alchemist, though. I'm not sure if the man's naturally gifted or just has the right kind of crazy, but he'd be a great asset. Gabriel isn't the only one who could gain a bloodline like this. Just think of the possibilities. Connor advocated. While he made a good point, I wasn't sure it was enough to offset what the man was trying to accomplish. It was one thing to make vampires far enough away that the problem was a non-issue. It was another entirely to have it inside my city. Seeing I wasn't convinced, you'd be able to keep a closer eye on it and shut it down if things go bad. Connor insisted. I wasn't swayed, but Abigail brought up a good point. While I won't get into the ethics of what he's doing, having him do it here is out of the question. Think about if he succeeds. She paused. If he actually makes vampires, our city will be forever known as the birthplace of their race. That kind of stigma isn't something I want attached to my home. Bah, who gives a fuck what everyone else thinks? It'd be cool to be known for that, Austin said. It's more than just what they think. It could impact everything related to foreign relations. What if people don't want to trade with a city of vampires? What if they attack strictly because of them? Additionally, if we're known as being closely associated with them like that, everything they do will reflect on us. If one goes off on a killing spree, the blame would be put on us as well as them. Abigail said. Austin kicked the snow. Calling us a city of vampires is a bit much. That's what will happen. Fine. We won't bring the crazy scientist man here. Austin gave up. Even if it sounds fun. All right, enough about this, I said. As much fun as it is talking in the snow with all of yous, I'm in need of a shower and a nap. So, Connor, if you could reach out and facilitate a deal, that would be appreciated. See how much this is going to cost us as well. Other than that, I have some materials that need to be stored and a trophy to put up. Abigail's eye twitched at the antlers but declined to say anything. We'll catch up after I get some rest. My following nap took much longer than a few hours and turned into over 12 hours of sleep, but I felt amazing after the long rest. The food also helped, as eating poorly grilled meats of animals that weren't that tasty to begin with wasn't the most appetizing. Most of the things I fought were predators and they didn't have the most appetizing of meat. The best thing I ate was an elk I came across, but that hadn't lasted me very long. The environment made it so the meat kept for a ridiculously long time, but I was a voracious eater. It was hard to get full with all the energy I expended, especially back in the castle. Most of the food pulled in was of the lower-level variety, which made me have to eat even more to sustain myself. Not to mention it didn't taste as good. With food and sleep, it was almost nice to walk into the living room for our long chat. The fire was roaring and the soft furs tickled my bare feet. It was no surprise I was the only one barefoot. Did you have to hang them there? Abigail said. I think they look good there, right over the fireplace. The antlers were huge, which made anywhere I put them seem gaudy, but the living room was the biggest room in the castle, made big enough to accommodate the whole family, which didn't make them stand out as much. They still did, but anywhere else would be worse. This tall ceiling also helped. If I'd tried to hang them in the council meeting room, they would have taken up the whole room. While you slept, I looked through the materials you brought and stored them away. All I need to know is what you plan to use personally versus what's up for grabs. Abigail started off. My mind struggled to remember everything I brought back. The best furs and pelts I plan on turning into clothes. The horns and fangs can go to whoever wants them. I don't have much use for them. Vincent wants one of the manacores to try making a staff, but other than that, I don't want much else. I took a gander at your basket of goodies and I have a question for you, Austin said, taking out a medium-sized horn. Why did you kill a bison? I laughed, remembering the fight. Well, I didn't set out to kill one. I didn't set out to kill anything really. Everything I killed was because it attacked me. The bison was an accident. I was running north and wasn't paying that much attention and nearly ran face first into its back end before I realized it was there. It was alone, away from its herd, and took my speedy charge as a threat. Not one to back down from a challenge, we fought. I won. I started searching ahead to stop running into fights I didn't want after that. Austin smirked. Not one to back down from a challenge, but you said yesterday that you ran from polar bears. I had given brief snippets of my travels, and the extremely threatening bears were mentioned. That wasn't a challenge. That was certain death. I said, "What's that?" He put a finger to his ear. "Is that a wuss I hear? I'd like to see you try. You wouldn't last 2 seconds against it." "How would you know? You ran before you could see it." "All right, you two. We have more important things to talk about than your dick-measuring contest." Abigail snapped, annoyed that her serious conversation got taken off the rails so quickly. Starting with, "How far along are you with the melding?" I'd allowed everyone a read through the technique so they knew the process. "Far enough that I'm not at risk. The main arteries are done, but I still need to do quite a few of the smaller ones. I split my time coming back between working on my bloodline and finishing the process. Both were dull work that got bland quick, which was why I altered between them. My heart was already strong enough to handle it, as the upgrade to it would hold even with the added pressure of mana. The arteries coming out of it were the first I worked on. If one of them blew, it would be a quick death from blood loss. "Where would you put your fighting ability?" "About 80%, I answered. "If I overstress my mana, it would cause some internal damage, but it wouldn't be life-threatening." "How much longer until you're finished?" "A month, maybe? It depends on how much time I dedicate to doing it. If it's all I do, a week." "How do you feel?" "I know it's not the same as my core, but it should be similar." "Wonderful," I said. "My mana feels endless and much more reactive than before. Skills come much easier, and the charge-up time for my bigger ones is a lot shorter." "Does your core feel the same?" "It's similar to what you described except for one thing. My mana doesn't feel easier to use. It actually feels harder, since there's so much more of it along with it being thicker. The same amount of mana holds more power now, which makes using skills efficiently difficult." Abigail described. "Is it the same for everyone who forged one?" I asked. "Of the people who succeeded, yes. I already knew who succeeded and who didn't. Of those who went, only 2 came back with a core. Abigail and Alice. Most of Alice's skills were ice-related, but she still had water as her affinity. A few failed, but that wasn't the end of the world. They would be able to try again. While only 2 of our family managed to forge one, other people went along to try. Some of Elliot's and Hal's guards went as well. Part of the condition of their signing up was that they had free access to all of our techniques. Those with the water affinity who wanted to forge one were a part of the group who left. All told, nearly half a dozen people stepped down a new path of power, which greatly boosted our strength as a city. Our chat continued, and we went over everything that happened while we were gone. It was a lot to get through, and it was hours later before all the stories were told. Austin's was especially long. "Now, as fun as that was, I hear we're in for a fight," Austin said and jumped up. "When are we doing this thing? You can't believe how boring it is here." What he was referring to was the pylon upgrade. With everyone's new advancements, we planned to go for it when everyone returned. It was half the reason Austin was still here at all. He didn't want to miss out on the fight, and he was here anyway. I half expected him to stay strictly to make fun of me for becoming a noble in a terrible English accent. "Cool your jets, Austin," Abigail said. "I have one more thing before we all leave." Her face was oddly serious. "Before we left, some rumors were going around in the city. We aren't sure if any of it is true, but Marcus came up to us and relayed what he was hearing." She started. "Supposedly, something was found in the south. No one knows what it is or how it got there, but they say it has a countdown. When it hits 0 will be exactly 2 years since we returned." There was a stunned silence as everyone worked to process the information. "That's in 4 months," I said. "I know. I'm not sure about anyone else, but that's obviously a sign. A big, glowing, blinking sign. We were looking for when our test would start, and it seems we now know," Austin said. "I didn't think it would be so soon," Hal said softly. "It could have happened sooner. 2 years is pretty long," Abigail answered. "Is that everything? Is there anything else you know?" I asked. "All Marcus told us was that something was found in the south and it had a timer. He didn't know much more than that," Abigail said. "How far south?" How did he even hear about it anyway? It's not like someone picked up a phone to call him. My mother asked. He said it was from a messenger. Someone was purposely spreading the word. What does it mean, though? Will we have to travel south? Depending on how far south we may have to leave now. Gabriel chimed in. I don't know, Abigail said. But it would be smart to be prepared to do just that. How long does that give us? I said, slightly annoyed. I only just got back. Leaving again wasn't on my to-do list, especially so soon. Well, we still aren't sure of the exact location, but we shouldn't delay too long. I've been in contact with Marcus and we should know as soon as he does, but it will be a long trip no matter what. Abigail said. Delay what? Hal played devil's advocate. All we know is something down south has a timer. It could be anything. The odds are against that. Things got a little more heated as ideas were thrown out, but we wouldn't know for sure until we knew more. We'll prepare but wait. Until we know something more concrete, we continue with our plans here. Speaking of, we should plan the pylon upgrade for next week. That should give everyone enough time to settle in after time spent away. It would also give me enough time to finish melding. If our test was on the horizon, I couldn't delay. Chapter 237, Martha's Tavern. Miles. Point of view. Wouldn't be that bad, his ass. Miles remembered his first introduction to the city, and everyone kept saying the winter wouldn't be that bad. All of them were liars. It was that bad. He couldn't see how anyone could admit otherwise, yet multiple people had. The giant firs helped, but it still wasn't enough to ward away the cold for long. Being out in it for as long as he was didn't help matters, but there was nothing he could do to help it. It was what his job required, and he'd already blown through his savings that he brought with him. Scraping together what he could from the few dungeon runs he signed up for had held him afloat, but that wasn't sustainable anymore. The wait between runs was longer than he could live off of what he made from one. If Miles was stronger and could go deeper than only the 6th floor, he wouldn't have that issue, but he wasn't. Especially alone. There was no one he trusted enough to go in with him. He was trying to get over his trust issues, but it was hard after remembering where he came from. People backstabbed and betrayed for the mere thought of getting something out of it. Let alone if he pulled something rare out of a dungeon drop. No, he'd continue alone even if he would get further in a team. His new job wasn't related to his profession, which didn't net him any essence or levels for it, but it paid enough to keep him fed and clothed. His wardrobe saw a massive overhaul since his first day in the city. Oi, Miles, are you listening to me? Frederick yelled and shook his shoulder. What? A clear indication that Miles wasn't. That load over there, I need you to take it to the West District. Philip's waiting on it. At least the sled is already packed. He led the horses toward the drop-off for empty sleds and walked them over to his new one with practiced ease. It had taken a while to get used to the animals and them used to him, but they were in sync now. It was trivial to direct them, and he barely needed to use the reins most of the time. Miles wasn't sure how he ended up being a delivery driver, or how he got sucked into being out in the cold all day, but the pay was some of the best in the city for a person who was working outside their profession. The Western District was where all the newest construction was taking place, and his newest load would be his 5th trip there of the day. At least after this one, he would be finished. The one good thing about the winter was the workday was short. The sun was already setting, and if work continued past sunset, it would get dangerously cold. Not even the incentive of hazard pay motivated people enough to work in the dark and the cold. The newly bustling streets were annoying to navigate through, but he arrived soon enough. The site had people all over the place swinging hammers or working saws to cut lumber to size. It was still mind-blowing to see just how much could get done in such a short time. A job that would have taken months to complete could get done in a week if the right people were on the job. Philip caught sight of him and the load he was hauling and broke out into a smile. The man was an odd one and got much too excited at the sight of building materials. Merci, Miles, if you could drop it over there. S'il vous plaît, Philip said before turning back to overseeing construction. The mixed French and English was annoying, but Philip was nice enough about it. At least he said most of the words in English, rather than some of the others who were assholes about it. Growing up near enough to the province made his French passable, but nowhere near good enough for a conversation. following the French-Canadian's direction. He was off on his return journey not long after. The trip back through the city was quicker since fewer people were out and about, which was a good thing, else he would be late. Miles wouldn't say he had many friends, but he had branched out of his comfort zone a while back and it had proven not as bad as he feared. He wasn't a loner, at least he didn't think of himself as one, but starting over in a city where he didn't know anybody was hard. Nathan had been his first acquaintance, the chatty cart driver who introduced him to the city, but Miles had found a few others like him to hang out with. Miles was set to meet up with Lewis and Gavin at the tavern, and it would be rude to be late. Even if Gavin was never on time and it would be him and Lewis waiting on him, that wasn't an excuse to be late himself. As he predicted, after a quick wash and change of clothes, Lewis was already sitting at their usual table while Gavin was nowhere in sight. "It's lively in here tonight," Miles said after sitting down across from the man. The taverns were one of the first things built after the houses, warehouses, and workshops were finished. From what Miles heard, since he wasn't here at the time, after the outer walls' completion, there was a frenzy of activity that saw streets of houses constructed in record time. That frenzy died off into something more sustainable since, but there were still stories about how quickly things were put together. Their notorious mayor had everything ready for when construction began. It's little surprise. Martha's husband bagged an elk and word got out. "I wouldn't be surprised if every seat gets filled tonight." Lewis laughed. His mouth watered just thinking about it. "Gavin'll be pissed if he misses it." "Have you already ordered?" Lewis looked insulted and Miles took that as his answer. His drink already being on the table should have been his clue. While part of him craved a beer, it wasn't yet to be. At least not yet. Word was production would start soon. While food wasn't scarce like he was used to, fresh food was a rare thing to have. Most meals through the winter were from stored grains and frozen meat, which weren't bad, and they were certainly better than nothing, but nothing beat a fresh meal. As Lewis and he waited on their third wayward friend, he noticed that the conversation was a lot more lively in the tavern than usual. While Martha's cooking and the prize of fresh meat were exciting, it felt like it was something more than that. Miles also noticed it during his deliveries. He wasn't able to stop and ask, nor would he have given the chance, but it was enough to make him bring it up. "What's got people acting weird?" Miles asked. "Is there some event I don't know about?" Being thrust into a festive atmosphere only a few days after arriving had been jarring. He'd gone from nearly starving to death, to 5 weeks of dull travel, to a giant harvest festival taking place. Having experienced being out of the loop once already, he wasn't keen to do it again. Lewis just looked at him oddly. "You didn't hear?" Miles shook his head. "What?" "The city lord's back," Lewis said happily. "And so is the mayor. Everyone's been talking about it all day. How have you not heard?" "I've been busy," Miles waved off. It certainly wasn't because he didn't like small talk during his deliveries. It slowed him down and caused him to take longer. Miles only had to hold in a few of his choice insults about the man, but he was getting better. Lewis noticed his face and knew what he wanted to say. "You really shouldn't curse him like you do." "I'm hardly cursing the man," Miles defended. "More like voicing my frustrations." "Well, you shouldn't do that either." "How would you feel?" Miles asked. "I put in all the paperwork and applications only for the man to disappear for months." He was only slightly bitter about it. He tried not to, but he got his hopes up after hearing about the assistant position only for it to go unfilled for months. Every time he asked about it, the lady would say they still hadn't made any decisions, and the next thing he knew, the city lord was off on a trip with no date for when he would return. He'd found other work, but it was still annoying. "You don't know how scary he can be," Lewis said before realizing something. "You've never seen him fight, have you?" Miles scoffed. "I've never even seen him, let alone seen him fight." "If you had, you wouldn't be saying such things," Lewis said and sipped his drink. It was at that moment that Gavin finally arrived at their table, only slightly late compared to his usual. "What are you guys talking about? Is Miles cursing the city lord again?" Gavin asked louder than Miles cared for. "I wasn't cursing the man," Miles hissed. "Oh, sorry." Was Miles voicing his frustrations again? Gavin mocked, impersonating his voice. I was just saying he wouldn't do that if he'd ever seen the man fight, Lewis informed. Gavin whistled as he kicked back his seat, teetering on two legs. I still remember seeing it for the first time. It's a sight to behold. What's so special about it? Miles couldn't help but ask. He'd seen plenty of people fight, some much higher level than him, and none were talked about in such a manner. Even the deadly fights he witnessed back home weren't that special. It's like watching a force of nature, Lewis said, wistfully, eyes distant, recalling the first time he saw it. He swings that hammer round like it's his God-given right, Gavin added with a chuckle. Without anything for him to add, Miles remained silent. Speaking of, Gavin plopped his chair down on all four legs and smiled. You'll get the opportunity to see it next week. What do you mean? Both Lewis and Miles asked. Word came down from above they're doing the next upgrade in a week. People are already signing up. Gavin's excitement was obvious. Why are you so excited? Lewis cut in. Didn't you nearly die last time? Gavin choked in offense. I didn't nearly die. It was only a scratch. I would have been fine. Wait, they just let people sign up to fight? Miles asked. I thought that was what the guards were for. Gavin shook his head. Anyone can join if they want to. You have to follow basic orders and not do anything stupid. But even you could participate. That was the exact opposite of how the fort handled things. Miles wasn't there long, but he had been there to see a wave attack. No one was allowed to fight unless they were a part of the guards. They claimed it was for safety, but Miles knew what it was really for. If they couldn't fight, they wouldn't level. If they kept the population's level controlled, they would always be stronger and remain in power. It was the same with the dungeons. The fort strictly controlled who had access to the dungeon, while that wasn't really a thing here. There was a wait list, sure, but there weren't any restrictions. How did you almost die, Gavin? I thought you were with the trackers. Miles asked. The fancy wolf pin the man wore was all he could talk about when he first received it. Lewis laughed while Gavin looked slightly ashamed. Well, you see, I may, or may not have, gotten ahead of myself and done something stupid. What he actually means is that he got arrogant and joined the warriors like an idiot. Lewis pointed out. I wanted to work on my short sword skills. I don't get to use them very often. Gavin exclaimed. And how did that work out for you? Gavin moped. I don't want to talk about it. The other two laughed. Now that he's back, are you still going to try for the assistant position? I can put in a good word if you want. Gavin said, trying to change the subject. I might as well. I've jumped through all the hoops already. May as well see it to the end. Miles answered. And put in a good word with who? You've met the man what? Once. Twice, thank you very much. But I know people. His eyebrows wiggled and Miles fought the sigh he felt. Yeah, and I know a dog who's more talented than you. Now we both can feel good about ourselves. Miles remarked. Hey, we promised never to speak of that. Then you shouldn't complain so much about it. Their night continued jovially and the food was as good as imagined. But Miles couldn't get the thought out of his head. What Gavin had brought up stuck with him. You could learn a lot about a person by the way they fought, and he wanted to see what everyone was so impressed by. Maybe he would sign up after all. Chapter 238. Are there any questions? Miles can't. Point of view. Somehow, against his better judgment, Miles found his feet taking him in a direction toward the walls. Gavin had talked him into it while Lewis tried to talk him out of it. The devil and angel were sitting on his shoulder and the devil won out. To be fair to Lewis, his mind was made up well before the two tried to convince him. Ever since Gavin brought it up a week ago, it had been all he could think about. The possibility of seeing the man fight was alluring. Plenty of stories were told about it that piqued his interest and he finally wanted to see for himself. Which was why he found himself armed and armored, ready for a fight. As he approached the growing crowd, he tried not to wince at the state of his armor compared to theirs. Miles hadn't exactly had the funds to upgrade what he brought with him, let alone pay for repairs. He'd left it dirty for so long the metal had started to rust. One of the worst things to do back home was flaunt something you weren't strong enough to protect. It's become a ritual for him to dirty up the plates of metal to make the chest piece look worse than it was. Same with the rest of his gear, strategically leaving blood in certain places to show that it wasn't worth a fight for it. That wasn't a thing in Frostheim. Everyone took extreme care of their gear, cleaning and polishing it in a week more than he'd ever done in his life. He'd watched Gavin do it plenty of times, even though he wasn't even a melee fighter. It wasn't only the state of his derelict gear that set him apart, but also the strength. Having used the same set since the tutorial, it was a bit behind him when it came to power. He left the tutorial high F rank and was now early E rank while also using the same gear. It held up and wouldn't break that easily, but it also wasn't the best thing he could be using. A coin pouch squirreled away in his home was meant to remedy that, but he hadn't saved up enough yet. New gear was expensive and there was only so much he could save in a week. With his new job, his daily expenses were taken care of, which left his profits from the dungeon free to use on anything he wanted. But that still wasn't enough for a completely new set. He could maybe afford a new sword, but that wouldn't mean anything if his armor failed him first. Still, he wasn't deterred from the odd looks he was getting and marched on anyway, no matter how much he wished to turn back. Signing up was surprisingly easy, and just like Gavin said, anyone was allowed to do it. You had to put your estimated power level and general skill set so they knew where to put you, but otherwise that was all. He didn't need to give his specific class or exact level, only general terms that would be obvious if someone was watching anyway. He was suspicious about what they were using this information for at first, but it wasn't all that secretive to begin with. Plus, how were they supposed to know where to put you if you told them nothing? Miles reached where he assumed all the other melee-based fighters stood based on the heavier armor, but his eyes searched the group with bows for Gavin. It wasn't hard to find him, and he had to fight a sigh as he saw the man's goofy wave in Miles's direction. Everyone who was participating had to arrive before noon, but everyone was well ahead of the proposed deadline. The last few trickled in over a half hour before time was up. Miles himself didn't wish to be late and had prepared accordingly, much like everyone else in the crowd. Said crowd was a lot larger than he'd pictured. This would by far be the largest battle Miles would ever be a part of. There were easily a few thousand people standing ready for battle. If he had to guess, it was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000. The city's population was only around 8,000 after the wave of new arrivals stopped when winter began. That meant over a quarter volunteered. Why were so many willing to fight when they didn't have to? The crowd had naturally grown louder as time passed, but a hush fell over right at noon as people waited expectantly. It wasn't much longer until a smaller group of people made their way from behind them, deeper into the city, to where everyone else stood. Miles didn't need to be a genius to know who these people were. While the city lord and his sister, the mayor, were the most well-known and talked about, that didn't mean the rest of the man's family were unknown. It was kind of hard not to be when all of them were such powerhouses. Not for the first time, Miles wondered what they went through for every member of the family to be so strong. He knew they all weren't at the same level and some were better than others, but for all of them to be above average was intriguing. Miles looked over the group quickly but thoroughly, trying not to drag attention to himself while also getting a good look at them. Every member of the group had gear leagues ahead of his. He wasn't close enough to see, but he didn't have to be to know flame and hammer sigils were stamped on most of it. The Molten Smith, as people started calling him, was the best smith in the city. Everyone fought to get the weapons and armor crafted by him. Not only was it the highest grade from the forging alone, but it was normally enchanted as well. Miles hadn't even seen enchanted gear before, let alone the level of craftsmanship that the man had. Unconsciously or consciously, Miles wasn't sure. His eyes drifted toward the center of the group. He expected some towering giant covered in ice from the stories, but what he saw was a regular man. He was far from unassuming though, and Miles could feel the power difference between him and the man, but the stories made him think he was more than just a man. The hammer he carried on his back was the obvious giveaway, if the subtle pressure he gave off wasn't enough. For all intents and purposes, he looked like any other person Miles knew. Sandy blonde hair, medium in length, and a well-trimmed beard kept close to the face. The man was smiling at what another had said, a spear wielder from the weapon he had on his back, while he walked to the front, laughing before saying something back Miles couldn't hear. The mayor, Miles knew what she looked like as she worked all over town, pinched her nose and shook her head. It looked like she was about to reach out with her staff and hit the spearman. It would have been a shame, too, as Miles had never seen a staff like that. At its top was a swirling light blue crystal of some kind that looked delicate. Delicate and powerful. For as long as Miles had been in Frostheim, and after all the fantastical tales that the townspeople spread about the man he was looking at, they all felt like lies. How could someone be described as a snowstorm of blood and guts and such savagery be jovially laughing and joking while looking like anyone else? Nothing was matching up with what Miles had pictured. Miles wanted to find Gavin and strangle the man for all the stories he told of the serious, noble shitman that commanded respect. Before that thought could turn into him picturing how he would off his friend, a switch was flipped. The man reached the lead spot and changed completely. He didn't change physically, as he still looked the exact same, but the air around him was different. Hell, the air around Miles was different. There was a weighted blanket smothering the area, and he was sure everyone could feel it. It wasn't pressing or pushing down on him, but just there. This is what they were talking about. I take it back, Gavin. Maybe I don't have to strangle you. No one was talking anyway, but they certainly weren't now as the man readied to speak. Thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I feel like I should warn everyone of what is to come. As you know, this will be our 4th pylon upgrade, turning our large town into a small city. Some of you might already know this, but I'll say it for those that do not. This upgrade will be different from the rest. There are 2 options to choose from. One, like the others, is a normal pylon upgrade, moving us from large town to a regular small city. The other is a noble pylon upgrade. Not only will it upgrade us to a small city, but it also comes with the noble title of Baron attached to it. While the title itself doesn't mean much, it has other benefits for the city that we can't ignore. Miles wasn't sure what he was hearing. He knew of noble titles from his tutorial, but it was never clear how to get them. He knew pylon ownership was required, but little besides that. Was it as easy as choosing an option and getting one? That didn't seem very hard. Miles highly doubted the title didn't mean much. There wouldn't be 2 separate options if the title wasn't that big of a deal. That being said, we're told that choosing this option will make the challenge we face significantly harder. I can't say for certain how high of a level we will face, only that it will be harder. Let me be clear, this wave we will face will contain beasts or monsters in the D rank. Some might even be higher than that. I don't say this to scare you, only to inform everyone of the risks and challenges they will face. The reaction to that was worried looks and shuffling feet. Miles himself wasn't sure he was prepared for the fight. He could fight above his level, but not that far above. With that in mind, we will be altering our usual strategy. The front line will not be down in front of the walls. I know that some of you could handle it, but that is a risk we don't need to take. I still will, and a few others have chosen to join me, but make that choice at your own risk. Second, we will be using the defenses this time. I know most of you have never seen them in action, and I warn you to not interfere with their operation. We've planned around them and will make sure no one gets in the way. And lastly, before we get into deeper specifics, now is the time to leave if you feel like you aren't up for it. There is no shame in realizing this. It only means you have farther to go until you are ready. Many broke away from the crowd after that. Some ran while others walked hesitantly away, deciding if they could chance it before deciding not to. Miles decided to stay. If he was on the wall, surrounded by over 1,000 others, the risk wasn't that great. He'd bet his life the walls would hold, and he was prepared to do just that. Being a melee warrior on top of the wall would make fighting difficult, but he had a few ranged options he could explore. It wasn't his strong suit, but he could do it. After the crowd sorted itself out, great! Now we'll get into the plan. First off, Hal will be leading all bowmen. Be it rangers, archers, or hunters, if you have a bow and shoot arrows, you will follow Hal's command. A brown-haired man with a bow stepped up. His armor was heavy for an archer, and his bow was larger and looked heavier than the one Gavin used. Mages will fall under Abigail. The mayor stepped up with her staff raised. Healers and supports will be under Ashley. A woman Miles didn't know stepped forward. Warriors atop the wall will fall under Elliot. A man covered head to toe in metal. Full plate with a metal shield and sword to match. All of it shining in the sun. And anyone willing to fight in the thick of it. A similar smile to the one he wore while walking to the front. Will be under me. Are there any questions? Chapter 239, Force of Nature. Chris. Point of view. Are you sure about this, Christopher? Abigail asked. It's perfectly safe, Abigail. Everything will be fine. I answered. She had been antsy about the fact I was allowing so many people to participate in what could potentially be a bloodbath. There was a discussion about not letting extras fight, but I shot that down quickly. We knew this wave would hold D-ranks, that much was assured. We also knew that these D-ranks would be much stronger than right-out-of-the-box ones, which made them potentially threatening to the masses. While I did agree that we needed to change our standing plans regarding waves, dismissing the extra people outright, even if they would be in danger, wasn't the way to go. They would be able to stand atop the walls and participate in whatever way they could. We built them thick enough to house thousands along its length and were well short of being overcrowded. The siege weapon encampments would need to be kept clear, but I doubted anyone wanted to be near the moving parts of something so robust. Where she fought me more vigorously was on letting people fight in front of the wall. She wanted to ban it outright, only leaving me, Jonathan, and Austin down there like old times. I fought back with an equal intensity. That was the crucible, the hottest and deadliest part of the battlefield and the greatest opportunity for growth. It was why I grew as fast as I did, and I wasn't going to take that opportunity away from others. I warned them and assured them of the dangers they would face by doing so, but in the end, I left it to them to decide. Choosing when a fight was achievable or above their head was another valuable skill to learn. Sure, I wouldn't be surprised coming out of this with a few deaths, but that was worth it in my opinion. It would be sad and unfortunate, but necessary. If all people did was hide behind strong walls, they would never grow. I wouldn't have grown if I hadn't done what I had. Obviously, Abigail and a few others didn't share my viewpoint. They claimed it was a useless waste of life to have people die when they didn't have to. I claimed it was a useful opportunity that I wouldn't take away their choice for. In the end, it took one of the rare times I used my authority to get them to back off. Their complaints were noted, and I made my decision against it anyway. In my head, I was in the right, and in theirs, they were, but that was the way of the world. If everyone had been against it and the entire council fought me over it, I may have caved, hell, probably would have caved, but only a few were. Most of the others were fine with it because it was a person's choice whether to participate or not. How helpful will they be? Some of them are barely E-rank, she said, looking over the large crowd. We shouldn't dismiss them strictly because of that. If they don't try, they will never grow. There will be all kinds of things sent against us, and not everything will be above them. They'll have things to fight. I assured her. Not all of the beasts summoned were on the same level. There would be some lesser foes for the weaker to fight against. It would be up to them to find them. Even if they didn't, they'd be able to do what they could and at least participate with the stronger foes. Oh, hop off at you too. This'll be fun. Austin interrupted. I bet I'll kill more than you. Austin, you've seen how I fight. You don't stand a chance, I said. He looked miffed. You weren't the only one to get some fancy upgrades. You haven't seen what I can do. All right, bud, you're on. I smiled. If you two could treat this as the dangerous situation that it is, that would be great. All work and no fun. You never change, Abigail. Austin sang. Are Braden and Vincent ready on the trebuchets? I asked, ignoring Austin's comment. Walls weren't the only thing built over the years. It wouldn't be a castle without siege weapons of our own, and we went all out for the ones we had. My Uncle Braden and Mitchell were the masterminds behind most of them, putting Braden's builder and Mitchell's carpenter professions to good use. Catapults didn't work well in the cold, and we weren't sure how to make cannons yet, so trebuchets were the weapon of choice. The ropes he tried to build catapults out of split and frayed when under tension in extreme weather, which was a good portion of the year. There was a workaround, but it was easier to shift to something that would work instead of forcing something that didn't. Dozens of the stone throwers were spaced out over the wall, and even more were mounted to the inner wall. Their range was extreme, allowing them to shoot all the way from inside the city. Coordinating such volleys was going to be difficult, but that was what practice was for. It was better to see what needed to be changed now than when we really needed it. This would be the first time our entire defensive capability was being put in use, and I couldn't wait to see how my city did. After my speech, people sorted themselves accordingly, and as the time drew nearer, I couldn't help but feel my heart beating faster. I'd spent the past week spending hours making sure the meld was finished. I was ready to finally go all out and see what I could do with my new heart. Miles' point of view. His nerves were starting to get the best of him, but he forcefully pushed them down. He'd been through worse, and he wasn't about to chicken out now. His time in Toronto was much worse than whatever was about to happen. This isn't your first battle, Miles. Stop shaking like a schoolgirl. He couldn't help it. He was far from the strongest, and it felt like an errant wind would blow him away. After following instructions, he found himself stationed near a few other warriors with some mages and rangers behind him. All the classes were well spread out along with various levels. It would be bad to have all the lower-level people in one area. The 3 gates were manned with the most people, along with the multiple towers along the outer wall, but he wasn't near those. Instead, he was next to one of the ginormous siege weapons spaced out over the wall. It wasn't his first choice to be near one, but that was where he was placed. The wooden monstrosity was tens of feet tall, and by the creaking, he didn't want to know how much weight was being used as a counter. The size of the boulders lying in piles behind the weapon was enough of an indication. As he fidgeted as time passed, the comfortable weight in the air changed. It started with a few of the higher-level people near him, and not everyone's weight was the same, but it spread out over the entire crowd. Everyone started to give off an intense feeling like they were ready to face down death. Only some carried the intense feeling, but it was enough to set him on edge. A chill blew over the gathered crowd, and the weight intensified. The next thing he knew, a notification popped up with the normal chime. Defend your claim. The 60-second timer felt like hours as he watched the numbers tick away. Orders were shouted out from the people in charge, and his body moved to obey. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from the timer. Before it hit 0, he couldn't help but look over the insane people down below. When he heard that fighting in front of the wall was an option, he thought it was insane. Who would choose to do that? Turned out, a good number of people would. Nearly 100 men and women milled about, readying themselves. Some were doing last checks on armor while others inspected their weapons. The city lord stood stoic at their head with his hammer planted in the ground at his feet, chatting with the spearmen, like it was just another Tuesday. The spearman donned a shining silver helmet while the city lord remained without one, his face bare. A helmet wasn't the only difference between the city lord and the rest. The man had multiple places where he wasn't as armored as the rest. A metal chest piece that covered his front and back and some plates fastened to his legs was all he wore. Metal greaves covered his feet and lower legs, but his knees were left bare. So were his arms. The metal pauldrons attached to the breastplate stopping at the shoulder. It was odd. Miles didn't get time to think on it more as the timer hit 0 and everything leapt into motion. Wood creaked as they unleashed their giant payloads, and his eyes tracked dozens of boulders through the sky, their arc carrying them from both beside him and from behind him. They flew high in the air before slamming down in the distance in explosions of dirt and soil, where he only barely could make out forms of something moving. Ratcheting sounds signaled they were reloading, but Miles wasn't concerned with that. Once he saw the mass of bodies, they were all he could look at. Another whoosh and more boulders, but they seemed to do nothing compared to the numbers running at them. This was the first time he'd seen so many enemies. Usually, it was a few dozen beasts at the most that attacked them in Toronto. Never an organized horde like this. His unfamiliarity was obvious, as everyone else leapt into motion following the siege weapons like they were used to it. Wondering what the city lord was doing, he peeked down below and saw him standing in the same spot, in the same pose, doing nothing. The spearman next to him was hopping up and down as a glow started to illuminate off him. Miles wasn't sure if the sun was attracted to him, or if it was something else. As the man disappeared before he could look closer, he felt like rubbing his eyes like he was in a cartoon. 1 second the man was there, the next he was gone. Explosions of light were the only indicator of where he went, as rays of it started exploding out from where the boulders were landing. Turning back to the famed fighter he'd come to witness was disappointing. He was only shaking his head slightly as he reached out and grasped his hammer. Miles had seen all kinds of weapons but never one like that. He knew what it looked like already from stories, but seeing it in the flesh was different. It was something else. Ice began to freeze over his entire body, and it was then that Miles understood the stories. Even as bows twanged and hundreds of arrows joined the boulders in flying through the sky, he couldn't look away from the man slowly walking forward. The oddity of how many arrows there were wasn't lost on him, even if his attention was partially diverted. Even if every person took up a bow and launched one, there was still more than what could be accounted for flying through the air now. His magic senses whited out as a tremendous amount of mana was launched next, but even that didn't take away from the feeling. The weight, slightly reassuring even though no part of it felt that way initially, got 10 times worse. Like being plunged to the bottom of a lake, it surrounded his every move. Miles realized then that the man had started running instead of walking. Magic rained down, forcing him to squint as every light imaginable filled the horizon with a painful intensity. Blue was most dominant, but that wasn't important compared to the sheer size of the impact. He looked back from the magical spectacle just in time to see something even better. One man ran into a wall of thousands and exploded in snow. It was too far to make out clearly, but the aftereffects were clear. A cold so intense exploded that he could feel it from hundreds of yards away rattled his bones. The bone-chilling cold made Miles want to curl up and go to sleep. The feeling came and went quickly, but it was hard to shake off after experiencing. A large section of the battlefield turned into a wintry hell, as that was the only way to describe it. Snow, hail, icicles, and large chunks of ice swirled around like a miniature hurricane without the rain. It wasn't long until the expanse of white was dyed a reddish pink. I get it now, Miles thought. This is where the name Red Snow came from. The stories didn't do it justice. Nothing could do it justice without seeing it for yourself. Gavin and Lewis were right. The man was a force of nature. Chapter 240 up for a challenge. Chris. Point of view. Oops, a bit too much. Sending the same amount of mana into permafrost and desolate blizzard as before caused the two skills to blossom out much further than anticipated. While it encompassed more enemies inside its radius, it also neared too closely to the wall. My new heart made funneling mana into the skills much easier. Before, it felt like I was forcing mana into the skills, while now it was like it wanted to be used. I'd practiced with the meld to ensure everything was up to par, but this would be the first real stress test. Austin, the bastard, was already off and had turned himself into a light show deeper in the wave, flitting about like nothing could touch him. I should have known from how confident he proposed the bet something was up, but I didn't think anything of it. He always had pure speed over me, but I would always win in a battle of endurance. With the cheeky bastard's new anchor, he was killing things a lot faster than he usually could, racking up the numbers at an astounding rate. If I didn't know any better, I'd say he was going all out from the gate to get an early lead I couldn't catch up to. We'll see about that. Thunderous booms fell as giant chunks of rock impacted the earth, spraying the area with loose dirt and sod, but I ignored them and marched on. I'd asked Braden and Vincent nicely not to hit me, but they couldn't make any promises. The teams on siege weapon duty were mostly a part of the construction crew. It didn't take any weapon skills or magic skills to work them, and it was a good opportunity to get them some essence. Even if they had a basic warrior class, killing things from afar with the trebuchet would net them some levels. That being said, with the 24 or so weapons launching their payloads throughout the ring of enemies, the same ring of enemies I was currently positioned in, they were slamming down a bit too close to home. I was sure I could take one. My new levels and defensive skill would keep me from being instantly pulverized, but I wasn't sure how bad off I would be. A broken arm or a few bones wouldn't be that bad, but I was not letting myself lose an arm again anytime soon. It was an annoyance I wasn't keen to put up with again. Now that I was in the thick of things, Avalanche started to get rolling and Glacial Presence ticked up its boost. My mana felt endless, and the extra oomph that went into creating my wintry domain made everything flow that much easier. I kept the big guns sealed. Frozen Rift and Shattering Hammer were still mana hogs, even with my new capacity, but they would see their time to shine. The boss, or whatever constituted this wave as a challenge, would get to see the culmination of my efforts. Felt good to get back into the battlefield like this. My trip north was filled with a bunch of little battles, one-on-one or a small group, but this me versus an army was where I thrived. It was the challenge. One-on-one versus a worthy foe would always be fun, but there was something about weathering a storm of thousands and coming out on top that felt right. The beasts sent against us were something I couldn't recognize. Furred bodies and forelegs were the only similarities to anything I knew. Teeth and claws were their go-to attack, like most things I'd fought, but they had some magical skills in their arsenal. Not that it mattered. All of their attacks either washed off frost armor or couldn't penetrate my skin. The times when a larger attack came and I felt the buildup of mana, Jotun's resistance would flare, and that was that. The beasts started in the low hundreds, the beginning of D rank, and were subtly rising as time passed. Rising past 105 to 110 to 115. As they grew stronger, Avalanche was more than capable of letting my stats rise with the challenge. It was enough for me to take a peek back at the wall, but what I saw there made me question why I was worried in the first place. The long stone bulwark remained unbreached and was far from being threatened. Skills poured down from atop it like a deluge of water, killing anything that neared. A particularly nasty storm of raging water made sure the main gate was kept unmolested. Abigail, with her new staff, and two others made sure that the gate wasn't threatened. Like any castle, the gates were the weakest link. The enchantment, wards, and treatment done to the wood made it as sturdy as possible, but it was a design flaw even magic couldn't fix. I wasn't as worried about the other two gates as they were on either side, but they had their own protections put in place. If you don't start burning your bloodline soon, you're going to lose. A sing-songy voice came and went before I could pinpoint its source. The wake of smoldering remains was my only clue, as that was certainly not a result of anything I did. While Austin made a good point, I wasn't sure if I wanted to open that door yet. I felt like the wave was sufficiently handled, and I doubted anything would go wrong, but it paid to be prepared. The advancements I achieved with my bloodline made it last longer than before, but it wasn't something that was endless. Fuck it. Activating it let me feel the familiar rush I'd gotten used to. It was much more powerful than at the start, but the feeling of ice-cold power was the same. The temperature of my body plummeted, and if I weren't already covered in ice, it would have begun to form naturally. I wasn't sure how far below zero my body became, but I knew touching it was a bad idea. Similar to how my hammer caused Austin frostbite, my skin could do the same. Finding that out had been a surprise. When I first gained my bloodline, burning it had limited changes. After spending the winter months purifying it and strengthening it, those changes were further exaggerated. My skin turned a shade paler than normal, nearing sheet white by this point. Standing next to Austin's sun-kissed tan made it even worse. It was hard to tell, but my hair further transitioned from sandy blonde to pure white. It used to be limited to the tips, but that transformation was getting larger and spread closer to the roots. Lastly, a change I couldn't see myself, but my eyes were altered. The cosmetic changes weren't the only things to grow with the additional strength of the bloodline. The boost it gave did as well. I felt closer to my ice, my muscles felt like they could swing more powerfully, and my body felt more robust. With the added purity, it was an all-around boost to what had already been powerful. Rising to the challenge Austin proposed, ice sculptures were left in my wake. It wasn't only my hammer reaping lives anymore, as anything too close to me died frozen stiff as the heat was sucked out of them. Even monsters 30 levels above me struggled to handle the cold. The ones without a Tier 2 law were the first to die, as they couldn't take it anymore. Reaching D rank for beasts didn't require an upgraded law and could be done purely with strength of body or their bloodline. With my bloodline overpowering theirs, there was nothing they could do to stop my laws, anchor, and skills from freezing them solid. My new mana heart was showing its worth, as I never would have been able to keep up with the mana costs to do what I was doing without it. I take back what I said. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. Austin called out after nearly a half hour of me sustaining my new killing speed. I smirked. This wasn't even everything yet. I still had fury to use, and my mana was still half full. Austin and I continued our slaughter while boulders rained down around us. The two of us weren't enough to stop them all. Far from it, which left those back at the wall a challenge of their own. One I was sure they would live up to. Both Austin and I were singling out the stronger beasts before they could get by, making the people behind us have it a little easier. Seeing that everything was going according to plan, I settled in and focused on swinging my hammer. I'd grown accustomed to the fighting style a warhammer required, and it was one I'd come to enjoy. There was a straightforwardness to it that I felt matched my personality well. Austin's spear was similar. He was flighty and sneaky, which matched his deceptively quick thrusts and stabbing feints well. I used sheer force. Feinting with a hammer was ill-advised. The weight it held and the power it took to swing it made quick changes or reversals nearly impossible. The swing would start and end where it was aimed. I knew it, the person I was fighting knew it, and the people watching knew it. That being the case, deception wasn't as useful. Power was. And if there was one thing I excelled at, it was power. Style still played a role in how I fought. When and how I swung was just as important as how hard. But that was something I was still figuring out. Similar to forging, I wanted to create my own style of fighting. Heavy weapon proficiency had stalled a journeyman, and to push it further, it felt like I needed my own take on fighting. Trying to zero in on that was exactly when I heard Austin call out, "Boss incoming!" I'd felt the pillar of power getting closer as the wave continued, but I'd assumed there was more time before it arrived. The beast responsible was hard to miss as it broadcasted its strength to everyone around. Its aura wide and stifling, similar to how I imagined my own felt. Its body was even more conspicuous as even the trees were dwarfed by it. Its size caused the ground to shake as it walked closer. The boss was the replica of what power looked like for beasts. It was common for them to increase in size as they did power, and this was an example of that. Looking around, I noticed the thinned ranks I stood within. Most had run past or around me to the wall. The rest were dead or dying strewn around the area. Only a few still stood, and they did everything they could to get out of the boss's way, leaving me with nothing to fight. Austin flashed next to me quicker than I could make out and stood to watch its approach. Giant wafts of steam billowed off his body as heat bled out of him. "You know," he said conversationally like we weren't staring at a powerful D-ranked beast. "As nostalgic as it is fighting side by side again, I could do without this dreadful cold. I thought you would be used to it by now. But then I was free of it for a while. Then you had to go and make it even stronger," he said, waving his bloody spear at the frozen sculptures. I pointed at the steam and melting snow. "It seems like you did the same. You didn't used to be able to melt it so easily." Boom! Stone exploded, and shards of rock rained down in the area, pelting anything close with the high-speed shrapnel. As we stood watching, a well-aimed boulder came flying in and impacted the boss. As far away as we were, it was a wonderful shot to whoever managed it. Except it didn't do anything. The boss didn't even look damaged, and where the boulder hit was unmarred. "Fuck me. Guess this'll be a toughie," Austin cursed. "Did you expect any less? That thing's gotta be in the 150s. I said. 142. I looked at him skeptically. "That's it." Felt stronger than that to my senses. "Yeah, I'm sure." He poked next to his eye. "Says so, at least." I didn't even bother with my identify as something that far above my level wouldn't even show up. "I've got to get a better one," I muttered. "What level did you kill down south?" I asked. The Queen was the highest level but wasn't meant for fighting. What guarded it was in the 130s, but we had more than 2 people to fight it. "You up for a challenge?" I asked with a smile. Austin looked over and shook his head. It was hard to read his expression with his helmet, but I knew he was smiling as well. "As long as I can hide behind you like old times, my lord." Oh God, it's already starting. End of chapter 240.